Today, we're going to be taught a very valuable lesson on what the ancient Egyptians were and what the ancient Africans were and the prehistoric Africans. Let's get to it.
Hello again. This is going to be a very brief account of the history of sub-Saharan Africa. It is as accurate as I am able to make it, and I shall be very happy if anybody at all can point out any errors or omissions. About 50 or 60,000 years ago, modern humans left Africa where they had evolved. That's Homo sapiens, our own species. Some of them left Africa and moved into the Middle East. From there, they spread into Europe and Asia. There were other archaic human species living in Europe and Asia, the Neanderthals, Denisovans, and of course Homo erectus. The modern humans who left Africa at that time used stone tools and were not very advanced, but this changed dramatically after they had been in Europe and Asia for some years. They began doing things like painting realistic pictures of animals and also carving images of imaginary beings, like a man with a lion's head. The people who stayed in Africa didn't do these things.
This is absolute nonsense. Sub-Saharan Africans, if you want to call them that, built tons of paintings and all sorts of things related to art before and after the modern period, if you'd like.
The weather is turning. It's getting slightly chilly here in the Drakensberg Mountains. We're staying at Giant's Castle, but we've come across something very, very unique and special and something amazing to immerse yourself into. So have a look at the rock art that's just next to us here. If you look closely on the bottom right, you'll see an antelope there. Ali's got it in the middle of the screen now. It's what I think it is an eland. I'm pretty sure it's an eland. It's the animal that you can find on these landscapes as well. They're really big, biggest in southern Africa, and they really had a great relationship, the bushmen, the sand bushmen, with the elands. You know, can you imagine what it would have been like to live underneath these rocks 5,000 years ago?
Not to mention the thousands and thousands of symbols that you find all over North Africa, which, by the way, the time he's describing where Africans just left Africa, there was North Africans still living in North Africa, so they wouldn't be sub-Saharan African. And of course, not to mention that these symbols correlated with symbols that you would find in sub-Saharan Africa. And then of course you have all kinds of paintings throughout the continent of Africa. And the reason why it's very difficult to date a lot of these is because a lot of kingdoms, a lot of, let's call them peoples of South Africa, stayed in some of these rock shelters till the modern day. And so the way you date these things a lot of the time is you find the food or whatever that's left behind and then you date the oldest one. The problem is, since people were still living in those areas, those got polluted. But the oldest that have been dated in Africa are literally the oldest in the world. Not to mention that the Khoisan people have been drawing drawings from like 25,000 years ago. Some found in Botswana.
Their art, if it can be called art, was limited to a few scratches on rocks. There's one from southern Africa, about 50,000 years old.
This guy is really, 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 really trying his best to give Africa no credit.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Galvin. I'm the curator of the African Rock Art Image Project here at the British Museum. We know that rock art was practiced over tens of thousands of years in Africa, and when people came by and saw these images, sometimes they changed them, sometimes they co-opted the symbols and painted them elsewhere.
So even the Europeans completely disagree with you that Africans didn't do this at all and they didn't have something called art but had a bunch of scratches. How ridiculous you are.
Which a series of lines, a bit like a hashtag sign, have been carved. The people who moved into Europe and Asia began doing all sorts of other exciting things, such as making flutes and drums, using lamps made from animal fat and so on. This was all long, long time ago in the Paleolithic age, the Old Stone Age. Again, those who remained in Africa didn't do this. There were no
Flutes have existed in Africa forever, and of course, the drums have existed in Africa forever. And not to mention that using fat, animal fat, to light fires has been used in Africa forever. But there's not really an importance of this in sub Saharan Africa, given how hot the environment is.
lamps in sub-Saharan Africa until somebody else invented them and took them there.
My question is, why is he using these three inventions as if they're like the pinnacle of human invention? You know, there was like string instruments like guitars, guitar like instruments made in sub Saharan Africa that date forever back in the day. Bow and arrows have been made since time immemorial. And of course, there's all kinds of paints and stuff that were found all over Africa that are mixed from bugs and, ochre, red ochre and yellow ochre. So why is he choosing to use a lamp? Why is he choosing to use a flute? And I even forgot the other one he said, but these are not the pinnacle of invention of that time.
People in Europe and the Middle East then began using wheels in making tools and weapons from copper. This didn't happen south of the Sahara Desert.
Actually, it did happen south of the Sahara Desert, and copper has been used all over Africa pre European or Arab invasion. But I'll one up you. Why are you using copper as the highest order? Pre colonized civilizations in Africa also used gold. As you can see, here are some examples. And of course, Nubia was called the land of gold. That's where the word Nubia comes from. Nuba means gold in ancient Egyptian.
In China and the Middle East, as well as Central America, writing was invented. It didn't occur to the people of sub-Saharan Africa to invent writing.
Well, once again, we have someone trying to pull a sneaky tactic on us that sub Saharan Africans didn't invent writing. Okay, so let's first check something. One, the Middle East invented writing and they moved it into Europe. Don't pretend that the Europeans invented writing. They didn't invent writing. They took the idea from the Middle Easterners. And then, secondly, the Egyptians also invented writing. At least that's the prevailing theory, that the Middle Easterners and the ancient Egyptians invented completely different writing. Thirdly, this idea that using symbols to depict something never existed in Africa is actually false. There's multiple ideas, multiple concepts of things that you would call writing, but they're not writing. It's symbolism in Africa all over that depicts basically a complicated symbology for communication. And of course, it's not writing because it's not written down, but it still was used for communication. Well, in order to answer this question, we should first figure out what writing is. Writing systems typically satisfy three criteria. Firstly, writing must be complete with a purpose or some sort of meaning to it, and a point must be made or communicated in text. Secondly, all writing systems must have a set of symbols which can be made on some sort of writing material, whether physical or digital. Thirdly, the symbol used in writing system usually mimics spoken word speech in order for communication to be possible. Symbolic communication systems are distinguished from writing systems. With writing systems, one must usually understand something of the associated spoken language to comprehend the text. In contrast, symbolic systems such as information science, paintings, maps, and mathematics often do not require prior knowledge of a spoken language. Now, I want to show you something from South Africa, which I hope once you guys all see this, you'll realize it fits the definition of writing outside of literally writing, which the digital version also doesn't fit that sign.
Even though the beadwork is now physically in New Haven, this collection nonetheless offers us the opportunity to forge connections with experts like Hlengiwe, and by so doing, come to better understand these important works of art. By so generously sharing her knowledge with us, we can begin to hear the beads speak, for as Hlengiwe will demonstrate, Nguni women encode an entire language in beadwork, messages that are intensely personal and often relating to matters of the heart. Wow. So, Hlengi, looking at this, can you tell us what you see here? What message can you read?
Okay, this necklace is, in fact, it's quite fascinating. When I first look at this necklace, I said like, wow, it's got that light yellow in Tlaga repeated many times. And then I've looked at the actual sequence of the beading, the way that they've put it. Remember that the beadwork has the negative and messages and positive messages. And then like the light yellow in Zulu, we call it Intlaga, which is read as, I am so sore at the heart because of the manner in which you spread our private affair to the public. So already I know that this is a negative piece. So whoever made this piece, it's not happy at all. So this person who made this piece, it's not happy that their private love affair has been spread to the public. And then I've looked like, what's the next size? And then I've seen that there were colors, which is more like a green color. I'm becoming very sick of this thing. So I become so thin because I'm so frustrated about the whole thing that you are talking. And then they've added the pink. And what is so galling about this whole thing is that fact that you are discussing this private love affairs of ours in beer drinker. So you're not just like talking to the public, but you also go to the beer drinker at bars and then you talk about our love affairs, which I'm not happy with. And then you see that there is a black on the necklace. It seems quite dark to me. I cannot see my way through these difficulties. So I'm not sure whether we'll go through with these difficulties. I'm so furious. That's why they added that red, which is umlilwana. It's a fire. So I am so furious about everything that is going on here. And then out of all that, they've put the blue, the turquoise at the edge. Although we are passing all these difficulties and then you keep on talking to the other people about our love affairs, but I still have hope that you change one day. It's the same like the weather changed. Wow. One day it's sunny, the following day it's raining. Same day you get three weather.
Unbelievable.
So and then like you look at this necklace, you said, oh, okay, so this necklace was made for people who are already in love. It might be that maybe they are engaged or married.
Wow, it's completely mind-opening.
In West Africa, there's been colors used to depict different messages as well. In the Maasai have a similar thing to what I just showed you, the beads. And of course, in Zimbabwe, they have these symbols that you see in these, they're all over the place. For some reason, these symbols repeat over and over again all over Africa. And when you come to South Africa, where they were documented and written down by a man named Frank Jollis and a plethora of other European scholars, when I first saw these symbols, I thought, cap. That's what I first thought. I thought there's no way in hell this is real. But there isn't a single scholar, not even one, who disputes these and their messages behind them. Okay, maybe there might be one, but that I don't know about. But everyone who has studied them knows full well that this is a real thing. In actual fact, these symbols were known even to the apartheid government of South Africa, and they even made documentaries about them. And it wasn't the most flattering documentary, showing that they didn't have a bias to show these things in a positive light, but nonetheless, they showed them.
To the north of Durban lies Zululand, the traditional home of that fierce warrior race that once scourged South Africa under the dreaded Chaka. The colourful beadwork made and worn by all Zulu girls is far more than just a charming decoration, for a whole secret language lies behind the arrangement of these bright colors and gay patterns, messages of constancy to an absent lover, or of reproach to a faithless suitor, all the schemes and plans of a designing Zulu maiden.
So far, I do not think I've said anything at all which can be contradicted or anything which is the slightest bit controversial.
The fact that he doesn't think that he has said anything controversial thus far is the wildest thing I've ever heard a human being say, ever.
There is no evidence at all for wheels, writing, lamps, or the smelting of copper in that part of Africa which is south of the Sahara Desert until these things were introduced there by Europeans or Asians. I'm very happy, as I say, to be proved wrong about this, and I invite those commenting to point out any such evidence, if they have it. We've now reached a point roughly 3,000 years ago with sophisticated cultures in China and the Eastern Mediterranean. We know about these people because they left written records. For the next 2,000 years, taking us up to the time roughly of the Battle of Hastings in 1066, an awful lot was happening in Europe and Asia. Gunpowder was invented, so was paper. The compass began to be used. Pieces of machinery were made from iron and bronze. Greek writers and philosophers like Socrates and Plato were at work, and so were Roman writers. Huge buildings were erected, places like the Pantheon and Colosseum in Rome and the Parthenon in Athens. The pyramids were built. In sub-Saharan Africa, life had changed little over the last 20 or 30,000 years.
Well, so now he goes again and lies in one of the weirdest ways. In fact, I don't even think he's lying. I think he's just misinformed. He says there was never anything close to any of those things that he's talking about. But first of all, the wheel had kind of made it to sub-Saharan Africa by this time. Secondly, the what about the knock culture in West Africa and other West African cultures that sort of predate Greece or Rome? What about the Congolese cultures with their many structures? What about the Chadic culture with their many structures? What about Great Zimbabwe? What about all these other kingdoms that existed? What about literally, I could go on and on and on. Like East Africa had a bunch of them.
Most people continued to use stone tools, although some working in iron was being undertaken.
I love how he sheepishly throws in, oh, some ironworking had been happening at this point, but most work was stone tools. And he sheepishly throws in, oh, some people worked in iron. Well, actually, by this time, the only people who were working with stone tools were like Khoisan and Hadza and the Pygmies. Everybody else at this point was working with iron. They had been familiar with copper. A lot have been familiar with gold. Some were familiar with the wheel. They'd been using cattle farming forever, and we don't even know how early that started. In fact, the whole entire expansion of the Bantu people all over Africa was fueled by the fact that they started using iron tools more and more and more and more than they'd ever used. And of course, they were doing farming in a ridiculous sense. And with farming comes astronomy. You cannot accurately do farming without astronomy because you need to check the seasons. And this is the entire thing. And of course, these people, the Bantu people, built multiple structures, sometimes just abandoning them and going back to a pastoral life.
There were no stone buildings, no writing, no inventions, no mathematics. Nothing had changed at all there.
I mean, I'll just give one example of an invention from sub-Saharan Africa, which is palm oil. And as you can see, it says here humans used oil palms as far back as 5,000 years ago. In the late 1800s, archaeologists discovered substance that they concluded was originally palm oil in the tomb at Abydos dating back 3000 BC. Now, here's the good part: palm oil from Elias genesis has long been recognized in West and Central African countries, used widely as cooking oil. European merchants trading with West Africa occasionally purchase palm oil for use as a cooking oil in Europe. Palm oil became a highly sought after commodity by British traders for use as industrial lubricant for machinery during Britain's Industrial Revolution. Palm oil formed basis for of soap products such as Lever Brothers. So basically, um, the palm oil invention is one of the best ones. And of course, you can see down there, by around 1870, palm oil constituted the primary export of some West African countries, although this was taken over by cocoa in the 1880s with the introduction of colonial European cocoa plantations. So Africa was getting rich off of this palm oil thing because you could see that it was part of the industrial Europe. And of course, people like to say we played no role in the industrial. It's like we provided so many raw materials, and I'm not even going to get into like the ideas and all this other stuff. And using palm oil as an oil, as you can see here, first of all, Egypt, like you know, doesn't really grow great trees and stuff like that. So a lot of the palm oil that is seen in Egypt, that 3000 BC, gives people the thought that palm oil trade with Egypt must have happened very early in in Africa, within Africa, because you don't really see palm oil go to any other place except um Africa. And of course, there's another tool that they used to use to climb trees, and I'll show you this invention. It didn't eventually take off in the world, but it's still an invention. This video was taken in the 40s, and it depicts a man climbing a tree using a harness style invention found in Africa. And it's still used today in parts of Africa. And it was migrated to India when they found out that you can grow palm oil in the same way because the climate is similar in India.
So far, we've traced the history of Africa from the first modern humans to the year 1000 AD, and seen that while in Europe the Stone Age had given way to various civilizations whose remains can still be seen, books and plays that we can now read, the works of thinkers like Confucius, Buddha, Socrates, Jesus, Tacitus, and many others, there was nothing at all like this in sub-Saharan Africa.
By the time of Jesus, there were plenty of scripts found all over the world. And some of them, I mean, to give some examples, there's Ge'ez in Ethiopia, there's ancient Meroitic in the Kingdom of Kush, which is only one of the writing systems in Sudan. There was Sibidi. I mean, there was so many versions of writing. And of course, I mentioned that there's some things that aren't considered writing, but are writing in West Africa and other places. And people have been having a hard time trying to convince Europeans that they should add them in complex symbolism.
Things only began to change when people entered there from other parts of the world. The Arabs from the Middle East, together with the Berbers, triggered the establishment of mosques and madrasas in Songhai and Mali. Buildings were still of mud, though. It was not until the arrival of Europeans from the 15th and 16th century onward that buildings of more than one story began to be constructed. This, then, is the history of sub-Saharan Africa as accurately as we know it today. I'm honestly at a loss to know how to put things any differently. No inventions at all have emerged from Africa for 20,000 years or so. Not since the bone harpoon for fishing was devised there. That was the last authentic innovation from sub-Saharan Africa. There was nothing like the telephone, radio, electricity, space rockets, nuclear reactors, antibiotics, or any of the other wonders of the modern world.
Black people have contributed in space rocketry, in telephone, in antibiotics since the beginning of the American industrial civilization. So I don't know why he's adding this point. And also, America has had, it has never just been a white civilization. Black people have always been there. I don't know why he's trying to add this point like it means anything.
These were produced exclusively by people of European origin. One suggestion which is often made is that colonialism is responsible for this lack of progress, but this is an absurd idea. For 50,000 years after modern humans came out of Africa and spread across the world, enormous strides were made by those in Europe and Asia. Nobody went to Africa and interfered for those 50,000 years, while things like writing were being invented in other parts of the world. It's only in the last 500 years or so, perhaps 1% of the time since modern humans emerged from Africa, that some Asians and Europeans have gone back to Africa to see what has been going on.
This guy is all over the place. First, he claims that the Africans are sub-Saharan Africans because there's other people who came back into Africa thousands of years ago, and then now he's claiming that how are you using sub-Saharan African and then switching back to nobody interfered in Africa? A lot of people interfered in Africa before modern colonization, and then secondly, there was a whole bunch of stuff that happened before and after, and to pretend that colonization did nothing, like to pretend that like slaves that are like captured in America are supposed to just invent stuff while in captivity, to pretend that Africans who are being blown out of their homes are supposed to just keep inventing things is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. And of course, there were some inventions in areas where they were more civil by both slaves and Africans, which you're not going to acknowledge. But to pretend that colonization did nothing is ridiculous. And of course, if you want to play a game, let's play a game. You want to play a game? Let's play a game. Ancient Egypt, right? If it's this area that's full of this inventive ability and inventive power, how come they haven't invented anything in the last, let's say, 100 years that matches what you're saying? You said the Middle East was this great inventive power. Where's their great invention? Where's their new inventions? And of course, there's other kingdoms all over the world where isn't it quite clear that oppression slowed down progress in all of these places? In Egypt, it slowed down because of oppression. In the Middle East, it slowed down because of oppression. In China, it slowed down because of oppression. And once they freed themselves, only then could they start making new ideas. In Japan, it slowed down because of oppression. So it's not a black Africa thing. Look at it. You said yourself, the Middle East, the greatest inventive power ever. They invented writing early. They did all this stuff. But then at some point they stopped inventing stuff, and they haven't gotten Nobel Prizes in the same way that Europeans have been getting, or Americans have been getting for the last forever, really. Why do you think that is?
Not much, they found. Just why this was the case is another question entirely, and I think we shall have to leave that for a separate video.